John chapter 18, verses 33 to 38. This is describing when Jesus was standing before Pilate. Then Pilate entered into the kingdom hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, Art thou the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou a king then? Jesus answered, Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born. For this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. Pilate saith unto him, What is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews, and saith unto them, I find in him no fault at all. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Allen.
I'm very pleased to be with you today. I come from Union College. I teach Seventh-day Adventist history there, as well as history of the Christian Church, and a couple of other courses here and there. And this last week, I've been sharing with my students a bit about the history of Union College. And it just reminds me that Union College really is your school. It is the people in the conferences in Kansas, Nebraska, and Minnesota and Iowa who gathered together 125 years, almost 125 years ago, to create a college that would train their children, their grandchildren, and provide workers in this part of the world and God's field. So as I teach at Union College, I have this great sense that I am really your minister, doing what you have asked me to do in ministering to your children and grandchildren and preparing workers for this part of God's field. Also aware today that this is the weekend where we celebrate Jesus' death and resurrection. And so I've prepared some thoughts today that focus upon Jesus and who he was and how we really come to know him. It strikes me that sometimes when we speak of knowing Jesus, we often put that kind of knowledge in a very separate category all on its own. We know what day of the week it is. We know who the governor of Nebraska is, or maybe most of us do. We even know our spouse in a special and a very personal way. But a knowledge of Jesus we often relegate to something that's sort of not material, that's distant, something that's unreal, and oftentimes irrelevant. It's put off in sort of a super spiritual sphere that doesn't relate to our lives. I'm a bird watcher. I enjoy seeing new birds. And occasionally I'll be in the forest and all the leaves and the trees and I'll spot a bird and I'll say, oh, is that a least flycatcher? And I just saw a glimpse of it as it flew off from one tree to the other, and I'll get my binoculars out and I'll be looking for it, and I'll see another flitter off into another tree. And I want to see a least flycatcher. Want to add it to my life list, but I got that one glimpse. And sometimes I think that a knowledge of Jesus is like that bird that flits through the forest. We catch a glimpse of it. It's ethereal, it's elusive, it's far away, and we never see it again. So we wonder, is it worth pursuing? Are we going to find it? Is the knowledge of Jesus something that can become real in our very real lives? John in chapter 17, verse 3 of his gospel, writes that knowing God and Jesus is the equivalent of eternal life. Praying to his Father, praying that to know you and your Son is life eternal. I think John's intention is to put us in touch with something that is very relevant to our lives. Something that's very real, something that's here and now, something that deeply affects our very existence in this material world. And what he's saying is that when we know Jesus, we've been put in touch with what is most basic to our existence, and that enables us to live now and in the future a new eternal kind of life. So how does that become real? So often we live as if the only thing that is real in this world is the material world. That's what most people live like. Reminds me of the comment that Carl Sagan, the astronomer, said. He said, "The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be." Now, what do you think of that? The cosmos, that is this material world with its planets and its suns and this earth, is all that ever was, all that ever is, and all that ever will be. That's a very materialist view of the world. And sadly, Carl Sagan lived that kind of a life. I looked up his biography and discovered that he had about 6 children by 3 different wives. Somehow, the biography in Wikipedia even describes that he worked very, very hard during the first few years of his life, and that may have contributed to the failure of his marriage. Marriages, perhaps. Didn't know that there was something beyond just work and a material existence. And oftentimes, even we who follow the way of Jesus live that kind of life as well. But what if there really is a kingdom of heaven that we can enter into here and now? Kingdom of heaven isn't just far away and a long time from now. But Jesus said he came to bring the kingdom of heaven. What if there is a kingdom of heaven we can enter into here and now? And what if God reigns everywhere except among human beings? So God's reign is something that is real and literal. And what if we can actually begin to live a life that's molded and formed by God, and begin to see him mold and form our world? What if that is a possibility? What if there really is a resurrection power available to us to deal with our hurts and pains and sorrows and challenges? I imagine what it might be like to live in the very far north. An Eskimo who knows how to build an igloo. They don't really live in those igloos, you know. They live in constructed buildings, but when they're off hunting and the weather gets bad in the winter, they know how to build an ice house. And suppose there was an Eskimo living in a remote island, and someone came and gave him a radio. And he looks at this box, and he sees no value for it. Why would I need this thing? And then the one giving him that radio shows him how to turn it on and tune it to the radio station. Suddenly what at first seemed of no value suddenly becomes very valuable to him. So imagine with me today a man living in the merely material universe being introduced to Jesus for the first time. He's got no idea of who it is that he's encountering. He sees no real value in this common Jesus to this common Jewish wanderer. And imagine with me today what happens when a man like this, a Roman centurion, no less, who begins to then check out who Jesus is. So, what does he see? What is he looking at? How is he going to make a decision about who Jesus is? And imagine with me today, this centurion is the one who leads out in the arrest of Jesus during the time of the Passover some 2,000 years ago. I'm asking you to imagine this because I'm going to try to weave together a number of different incidents related to Jesus' arrest and trial and crucifixion. And I'm going to imagine that that centurion is the man who was present at each one of these. I don't know that. I can only guess. But when it comes down to the end of the story, we do know there was one centurion who took a look at Jesus and saw him in an entirely different way. So what brought him to that place? What did he see over this period of Jesus' arrest, Jesus' trial, and Jesus' death that led him to reach a new conclusion about Jesus? So I'm assuming that he starts out merely as a Roman centurion, raised somehow in Rome, raised to only know the material universe we live in. You say, well, they worship the gods and expected the gods to do things. Well, yes, but they only did them within the material world. And the gods were only slightly better than simply human beings on a sort of supersized style. And I imagine that perhaps this centurion had heard of Jesus before, but knew pretty much nothing about it. But he's given the task of going and leading the group of soldiers to arrest Jesus. He's not prepared for what happens. They meet Jesus. They find him in prayer. Jesus doesn't resist them, but one of his disciples does, pulls out a sword, lops off the high priest's ear, and then Jesus takes that ear, puts it back on the man's face, as if nothing had happened, and all the disciples just melt away. Soldiers try to grab one of them, and they grab a sheet that he's thrown around his body, and they discover he didn't have anything underneath it. He goes scampering off, Mark tells us. Kind of a funny aspect of that whole event, but here's a Roman centurion taking Jesus, someone that he's been ordered to arrest, up to the high priest for a trial. I imagine, and I don't know, that this Roman centurion had decided that the best way to deal as an occupying commander in this area was to learn a bit of the local languages. So I imagine he learned enough Aramaic to get along, and that as he stood in the back of the Sanhedrin, the judgment hall of Caiaphas, he understood what was going on. And he heard the contradictory testimony. One says this, the other says that. They can't come together. And I imagine that he sees Jesus there, not cooperating, staying silent. Now, most of you are probably aware of the Miranda rights, that if you ever get arrested here in the United States, the Supreme Court decided that you need to be informed of your right to remain silent. Well, I always thought that if you got arrested and you were innocent, you wanted to talk about as much as you could. You wanted to prove your innocence to the arresting officer or to the investigative part of things. And then, as I was pastoring in Los Angeles, shortly after the O.J. Simpson event, one of my church members was watching the Super Bowl. And one of his teams was playing, and his wife had planned a party with a bunch of family members, pretty much at the same time. And she said, it's time to go. And he said, I gotta watch what happens. She said, it's time to go. He said, no, I want to see, here, it's almost over, wait. She went over and turned the television off, and he went over and hit her. Bad thing to do. Something that he shouldn't have done. She was so angry, she called the Los Angeles Police Department. They came, and they took him away, much to her chagrin, and booked him and released him, and I don't know if they went to the party or not, but the next day he called me and he said, you know, they're inviting me to come down to the station, and they're wondering if I want to talk to an officer. I said, let me call one of the lawyers in our church and I'll ask him what we ought to do here. So I called my friend and he said, in the current environment, the investigator is going to want to get as much evidence as he can to get a conviction. That's all they're interested in. So the wisest thing for him to do is to refuse to talk. Say nothing, volunteer nothing, or else they'll take whatever he says and use it against him. And so that's exactly what my friend did. He said, no, I don't want to come down and talk. No, I have nothing more to say. And they dropped the case. Jesus must have known the same thing. Must have known that whatever he would say in this court of law would be used as evidence against him. So he said nothing. Mark chapter 14 picks up the story in verse 61. The high priest, being exasperated, finally says to him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Mark has the high priest ask the central question of the whole book of Mark. Who is Jesus? Is Jesus the Messiah? Is he the Son of the Blessed One? In other words, the Son of God? And again, you know, the wise thing for Jesus to do would just be quiet. Say nothing. You know, they wouldn't have any evidence to convict him. They'd have all this conflicting evidence that otherwise he said. You know, the wise thing, just keep your mouth closed. But the high priest is asked this question. And Jesus feels that if he doesn't answer, that's evidence against him as well. And evidently he felt this was the time to say it, so he answered in verse 62, I am. A phrase filled with deep meaning to the Jews who knew that that was the name, the personal name of God himself, Jehovah. I am, Jesus says. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Almighty One, coming on the clouds of heaven. It's quite a claim. Jesus had spoken of himself as the Son of Man. Clearly, he refers to himself here as the one who's going to be sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, coming in the clouds of heaven. This man who the centurion will see simply as a common Jewish rabbi. You kind of wonder how a Roman centurion would think about someone making that claim. In fact, what would any materialist person, Carl Sagan, think of Jesus saying, someday you're going to see me coming on the clouds of heaven, sitting at the right hand of God himself? How do they react to that kind of claim? Well, our centurion, we're imagining, is a member in good and regular standing of the world of disbelief. He doesn't believe in anything. Well, maybe the gods up there can somehow touch a thing or two, make things better for you, but he's a practical man. He wants to see the evidence for it. So he hears
Jesus make this claim, what are the options? How can a man make this kind of a claim? Well, there's 4 alternatives. Perhaps he thinks, this is the kind of way that someone who comes from that perspective might think. I'm, again, speculating, but we're imagining this. 4 alternatives. First of all, maybe he's a bad man. Maybe he's a kook. Foolish, deluded soul. You've heard of people who think that they're Theodore Roosevelt, and they want to go lead the charge up the hill. Well, we find them in mental institutions. That's an option. He's imagining that he's someday going to be seated at the right hand of God, coming in the clouds of heaven. That's kind of a crazy idea for any human being to think about. So maybe he's just a bad man. Another option, number 2, he's a charlatan, a trickster, a fraud. Someone pretending to be important in order to attract followers and get power and wealth. He's just a pretender. And any Roman centurion worth his salt is going to think of a third alternative as well. He's a revolutionary. He just looks good. He's trying to pretend like he's not involved in anything nefarious, nothing that's going to be rebellious. But really, ultimately, his intent is the violent overthrow of the Romans that they hate. And that's an option. Maybe Jesus is a violent revolutionary. I would guess at this point in time, if the centurion is there looking at Jesus, he doesn't even consider the 4th possibility. The 4th possibility that maybe Jesus is who he claimed he was. Maybe he really is the Son of God. Maybe he really is the Son of Man who's going to sit on the throne next to the Blessed One and come in the clouds of heaven. No, he doesn't even think of that. So maybe he's a madman, maybe he's a charlatan, maybe he's a revolutionary. And so I imagine this centurion getting ready to check Jesus out. And notice that the centurion cannot come to know Jesus. He cannot come to know Jesus as a heavenly ruler unless he comes to understand that his assessment of Jesus from a material ground is inadequate. I'm going to say that again. A person who doesn't know God, who doesn't know the spiritual world, like this centurion, they cannot come to know Jesus as a heavenly ruler unless they come to understand that their assessment of him on merely material ground is inadequate. They have to work through the possibilities from a material perspective. And they have to come to the place where they recognize that the material assessment doesn't work. So how does that happen? How does the centurion here do that? Well, let's watch. Let's take a step back and look and see what happens. After the trial before the Jews, where they convict him of being the Messiah, basically, the centurion, we imagine, takes charge of Jesus and takes him to Pilate, the Roman governor. The Jews cannot execute Jesus on their own. They have to take him to the Romans, who alone have the right of capital punishment. And after reading Pilate the charges against Jesus, Pilate's first question to Jesus is, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And again, here's Jesus in a trial situation. He knows how to be quiet and how to stay silent, the importance of doing that. But here in front of Pilate, instead of remaining silent, Jesus replies, "You've said so." Yes. John describes the encounter in a little more detail. We read that in our scripture passage. And we find that, again, Pilate's first question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Well, is that your idea or did somebody else tell you?" And Pilate says, "Hey, I'm not a Jew. I only know what somebody else tells me." "What have you done?" Pilate expects a materialistic answer. He expects Jesus to describe, "Well, I'm only trying to lead a group of people. I'm only a religious leader," or something like that. And Jesus answers in John 18:36, "My kingdom is not of this world." Yeah, I have a kingdom. It's not of this world. "If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but now my kingdom is from another place." "Oh, so you are a king then," Pilate says. Jesus answered, "You're right. I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world." Jesus knows exactly what he's there for. He knows his purpose in life. He knows that he's reaching his destiny in front of this man, Pilate. He's here for a reason, and he's here to testify to the truth. And everyone on the side of truth listens to me, he says. Pilate, committed to a materialistic worldview, does he know anything about truth? Our world today is a world of unbelief because they don't even believe that truth is even possible. You can't know truth. It's all subjective. It's all just inside yourself. There's nothing out there that you can say, "Yes, that is truth." Pilate says, "What is truth?" Can't know truth. Truth's just something that you perceive inside yourself, what works for you. And so John tells us that with this, Pilate went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." Here's Pilate, the Roman governor, heard the charge. He's heard the charge from the Jews. He's interrogated Jesus himself. He finds no basis for a charge against him. Now, he's the Roman governor. If Jesus is a revolutionary, if Jesus is going to lead an insurrection against Roman rule, Pilate would care about that, wouldn't he? He would certainly not say, "I have no basis for charges against him." So Pilate clearly has decided that Jesus is not a revolutionary. He's not a threat to Roman rule. His kingdom is not of this world. He's got some sort of crazy abstract idea about truth, but he's no threat to me or to Rome. And so we're imagining the centurion witnessing this. Centurion says, "Okay, we'll cross that possibility off. And maybe he's just crazy. Maybe he's just some sort of religious nut. Or maybe he's just a fraud, pretending to be somebody important." And so Pilate lets the Jewish leaders in, and well, he doesn't let them in, he goes out to them, actually, because they can't come in. And he lets them get at Jesus. And they accuse him of all kinds of things. But every one of those things is a violation of Jewish law. They don't accuse Jesus of trying to raise an army, gather a group of people to oppose Rome. They don't accuse him of trying to get wealth or take power. And this time Jesus again remained silent. He's in perfect control. He doesn't respond to their attempts to bait him. Doesn't seem to be a shyster or a charlatan or some sort of confidence man that wins people in order to get something from them. And so I would guess that as our centurion is witnessing this, and he sees Pilate's reaction to Jesus, that he concludes, both Pilate and the centurion conclude, that the Jewish leaders are kind of on a witch hunt against one of their religious opponents. And Pilate really has little interest in getting involved in those kinds of things. He just wants to preserve order, and so he comes up with a scheme. Every time at Passover, I let one of Jewish prisoners go. I don't care who they are. One of them isn't going to hurt anything. I'll just let one of them go. And so he proposes that, according to this custom, that he release Jesus to them. Pilate, in Mark 15, introduces Jesus as he's ready to release him. He says in verse 9 of Mark 15, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" That becomes the central issue as we move through the final hours of Jesus' life. Pilate says, "Here's the King of the Jews. You want me to release him to you? Be your king." They say, "No, we want Barabbas instead." Pilate asks again, "Well, then what should I do? Was this man that you call King of the Jews?" Second time, Pilate refers to Jesus as the King of the Jews. They respond, "Crucify him. Crucify him." The call is bloodthirsty. The call is chilling. The centurion, looking at this response to what Pilate has called the King of the Jews, wonders, why do they hate him so much? A harmless fool, a pretender, would not provoke this kind of gut-wrenching hatred. When I was 15 years old, I was in Singapore in school. We took a trip up into central Malaysia. And, as I was getting on a boat to go out to an outer island, I watched an interaction between a young local boy and a Chinese boy, about the same age. And the local boy began to tease the Chinese boy, began to attack him, and the hatred was so palpable, I was appalled. I think that's kind of what's happening here. Centurion sees this hatred, knows there's something else going on, knows that there's some basis for it, as there was in that interaction with those boys. But Pilate decides, okay, you want to get rid of your king? I'm happy to cooperate. I represent Rome. Rome's the final authority around here. It's about time you understand that Rome has got the final authority. I know what to do with your kings. Yeah, we crucify him. Okay, we'll do that. Sure. That's what you want. It's your king. And so they take Jesus off, and I imagine they give to the centurion the responsibility of that execution. And what he does is he goes and first flogs Jesus. And I had to ask myself, why did they flog him? I mean, they're going to kill him after all. Why did they need to do that as well? And perhaps it was just part of their execution ritual. But I'm guessing that the centurion decides he's going to watch how Jesus deals with this. What happens to Jesus during the flogging? Maybe it's further evidence to decide who Jesus is. Is he a madman? Is he a pretender? Is he a real king? And so they beat him mercilessly, blood flowing. How does Jesus respond? No response. No hatred, no anger, no response. And so they decide to try another tack. They make fun of him. Mark 15, 16 to 20 describes how the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the Praetorium, where the king would reign. And they called together the whole company of the soldiers, and they put a purple robe on him, purple only worn by royalty. And they wove a crown of thorns and set it on him. Only royalty wears crowns. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff, and they spit on him. Falling on their knees, they worshipped him. And when they mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put on his own clothes. And they led him out to crucify him. I imagine the centurion watching this wonders, what is Jesus doing? He doesn't react. He doesn't respond. He doesn't lash out. He doesn't give in. Oh, well, no, I'm really not a king. Please let me go. If he's not a violent revolutionary, if he's not a madman, if he's not a pretender, then who is he? And the centurion really doesn't have many other options to take a look at. Since the time of Jesus, many have assessed him from a materialistic point of view. They've seen him as merely a good man, a teacher of great timeless truths. Some of them have seen him as, or portrayed him as, a revolutionary. But the centurion gets the sense there's something more to this man. He doesn't fit the categories that I'm used to dealing with. Who is he? And the centurion then gets to put Jesus then in a crucible, in a vice, to test him out and see exactly who he is. Because he gets to tighten that vice down and get to the essence of who this man is. Because he's going to die. Most men curse God or simply give in the face of death. But this man, as he's taken to the place of crucifixion, offers forgiveness to those who are doing it to him. Pilate puts a sign on the cross that says, "The King of the Jews." And this centurion begins to wonder, wow, could the cross be a throne? They say to Jesus, Mark 15:31, he saved others, but he can't save himself. And I imagine the centurion saying, well, what do you mean he saved others? And he begins to hear the stories of Jesus' healings and Jesus bringing back to life people who were dead. He saved others, but clearly he wasn't going to save himself. He was intent on going through with this crucifixion. And if he could save others and he doesn't save himself, why doesn't he save himself? Was he a king whose throne was the cross? And then someone from the Jewish leaders yells at him, verse 32, let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe. And even the religious people, those who supposedly believed in God and who sought to do his bidding, they're really the disbelieving ones, because even if Jesus had come down from the cross, they wouldn't have believed in him. They hated him. So the centurion, watching the crowd, watching Jesus, the centurion concludes that the Jews knew that this man was not a pretender. They knew he wasn't somebody trying to get power and become the king. He knew that those Jewish leaders took his claim seriously, because there was plausible evidence that he really was the Jews. And that's why they killed him. That's why they rejected his claims. And the centurion watches the two other men crucified with Jesus, watches how they're angry and bitter at first. Jesus is calm. And apparently his agony is much deeper than mere physical pain. About noon, Jesus cries out, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," he says in Aramaic. And I imagine the centurion says, "Yeah, I think I understand. Well, what does that mean?" And someone says, "That means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He's quoting David. And I imagine the centurion saying, maybe that's the source of his agony. That he really does feel forsaken by God. And if he's a fraud and if he's a madman, he's not going to call out to God in this kind of a time frame. They offer him vinegar to deaden the pain. He refuses it. Most unusual. And then as they're watching, this man goes from being completely alive, crying out to God, to finally saying, "It's finished. Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." And his head slumps down. And he stops breathing. Scripture says there was an earthquake at that moment. The centurion reels with what's going on. And the centurion who tried to see Jesus as a madman, that didn't fit. Tried to see Jesus as a pretender, that didn't seem to fit. He would have admitted it by now. Tried to see Jesus as an insurrectionist, a revolutionary, but clearly that wasn't who he was. When the earth stops shaking, the centurion says to the rest of the soldiers around him, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Amen. The disciples haven't come to that conclusion yet. But this man, looking at the evidence, looking at it purely to begin with from a materialist point of view, comes to recognize that here was a person who had within himself something beyond this world, a divinity that transcended the material world, a man who really truly could someday be sitting at the right hand of God himself. He'd acted like a king. He'd been convicted of being a king. He then must be the king. Now I imagine what this centurion might have wondered when the word of the resurrection began to percolate around Jerusalem. Where's he at? He's recognized in Jesus something unusual, something beyond the material world. I don't know. I really don't know how the centurion would have reacted to the word of Jesus' resurrection. But I know for us today, our conviction about who Jesus is comes partly because we know Jesus didn't remain in that grave. That he burst the bubble of the materialistic world, and that he comes to show us God's presence among us even today. I find in the message of Jesus and in the facts of his life and death and resurrection a reality beyond this material world, and one that gives me hope for eternity. I hope you find that too. We can know him. We can know Jesus in a way that's just as real as we can know anything else in this world. And we can know life eternal here and now as well.